Welcome to Daily Variety, your daily dose of news and analysis for entertainment industry insiders. It's Monday, July 6th, 2026. I'm your host, Cynthia Littleton. I am co-editor-in-chief of Variety alongside Ramin Satuda. I'm in LA, he's in New York, and Variety has reporters around the world covering the business of entertainment. On today's episode, in our box office segment, Variety's Rebecca Rubin unpacks the franchise fatigue that probably led Universal and Illumination's Minions and Monsters to the lowest box office opening yet for the Despicable Me franchise, during what was a muted July 4th holiday weekend. And then Variety's KJ Yossman in London joins me to explain what went down this morning with Comcast Sky buying most of ITV. But before we get to that, here are a few headlines just in this morning that you need to know. More huge changes are coming to Xbox. Microsoft's gaming division is about to shed 3,200 jobs, and they will sell off game studios Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, Compulsion Games, and Double Fine Productions. It's a huge realignment for the company, and it comes a little more than 4 years after Microsoft acquired Activision Blizzard. No doubt about it, the World Cup is a hot property in the U.S. The numbers are in and they are consistent, and they have truly exceeded the expectations of Fox Sports and Telemundo. Happily so. The U.S. men's national team plays Belgium at 5 p.m. Pacific time today in their quest to advance in the tournament. That game is expected to deliver NFL playoff level numbers for Fox and Telemundo based on the interest so far. All of these stories and so much more can be found on Variety.com right now. And now it's time for conversations with Variety journalists about news and trends in show business. If it's Monday, we're talking box office with Rebecca Rubin, Variety's box office boss. It was a tough frame for Studio Pictures this time around, but the Indie Angel Studios got its George Washington biopic, Young Washington, off to a very solid start. Rebecca Rubin, thank you so much for joining me after a very toasty July 4th weekend on the East Coast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm guessing a lot of people retreated to the air conditioning of movie theaters this weekend to get away from the heat dome.
I'm sure people did go to the movies to try to get some air conditioning, but also because the July 4th holiday landed on a Saturday, a lot of people think that actually diminished the box office because typically Saturday is the most popular day to go to the movies, but on July 4th, I'm sure a lot of people were barbecuing and watching fireworks and celebrating outside. And so it wasn't as big of a holiday weekend. I also think the World Cup, there were a few exciting games that might have taken away more of people's attention in terms of not going to theaters.
Yep, I watched France versus Paraguay yesterday and found out why Mbappe is the global renowned soccer star that he is. It's been interesting to see that tournament really build. Obviously, not a great weekend for the Despicable Me franchise. Minions and Monsters did not open up to stellar numbers. Rebecca, what do you think's going on with this movie?
I think it might be a little bit of a case of franchise fatigue. This is kind of an interesting opening weekend because the Minions and Monsters movie opened to 36 million over the traditional weekend and made 64 million since Wednesday, and that is by far the worst start in this franchise, but it's doing very well internationally. This is a franchise that tends to be pretty popular overseas, and it's made 100 million to date. It opened last weekend in a few territories, and so the movie has made around $160 million globally so far. And so it's hard to knock that kind of business because it doesn't have the biggest production budget compared to some other animated properties. Like the Toy Story movies are much more expensive. This one cost $85 million. And so it's definitely a disappointing start, especially at the domestic box office, but it's not necessarily this big financial wipeout. That is an important distinction to note. But what's interesting is it has good reviews and it has great audience scores. I think the Rotten Tomatoes was a 91%, and then the cinema score was an A-, which is very positive. But This is the 7th film in the franchise, and that's across 16 years, and so there might just be an oversaturation point. There's been a new Despicable Me movie almost every 2 years, and I think just in contrast to something like Toy Story, where there's only been 5 movies over 30 years, there's a bit of a scarcity that benefits that property.
The word of mouth does matter. And for more evidence of that, let's just ask Supergirl. Rebecca, at this point, what do you think? What is the best hope for Supergirl?
I think, unfortunately, the best hope would be going to PVOD as soon as they can get it there and salvage some of those marketing dollars and try to recoup some costs. But unfortunately, this film did not rebound in its second weekend. It had a pretty brutal 75% decline from its opening weekend. So it made around $9.6 million. So far, the movie has earned $58 million domestically and around $100 million globally. And it was quite expensive. It cost $170 million to produce. And so it's definitely going to wind up as a massive money loser for the studio. And so it's definitely a speed bump in the newly rebooted DC universe.
Let's talk about Toy Story 5. Did it hold up well in its third weekend?
The turnout for Toy Story 5 is another interesting point about actually Minions and Monsters, because it shows that families did go to theaters this weekend. It's not like they were all staying at home and barbecuing and enjoying the holiday. Toy Story, in its third weekend, it made around $31 million, and that has brought ticket sales to $366 million domestically and $764 million worldwide. So it's continuing its really strong run, and right now it's poised to be the highest grossing entry in the franchise.
Anything stand out to you about this past weekend or anything next weekend that you're particularly looking forward to?
Well, just so we don't give all the grief to Supergirl, I just want to point out that Jackass Best and Last, which also opened last weekend, also had a week debut and then a very harsh decline as well. Jackass made about $2.7 million in its second weekend of release, and that was a decline of about 68%, which is pretty brutal. And so far, the movie has made around 14 million domestically, 20 million worldwide, and so it's almost certainly going to be the lowest grossing Jackass movie. But unlike Supergirl, this is a very thrifty movie. It cost just $10 million to produce, so it's definitely not going to be a big write down or anything like that. But people definitely seem to reject this movie.
I suspect this will be something that plays forever for them on Paramount Plus.
There was actually one other movie that opened this weekend. It was Young Washington, which is from Angel Studios. They do a lot of faith-based inspirational films, and this movie was, of course, smartly timed to the Independence Day holiday. It's about George Washington before the Revolutionary War, and it did very well. It made $20 million in its opening weekend, and so they have a niche there that they have found with this demographic. They definitely know their core audience, and the moviegoers who tend to see these films often give them very good audience scores. This one had an A grade, and so that usually bodes well for how it's going to do over its run, and so it's another win for Angel Studios.
Good news for exhibitors.
Next weekend will be interesting because Disney's live action Moana is opening, and I think that's going to be a test case of how Disney proceeds with these live action remakes, because they've had a lot of success with the ones that were remaking movies that came out in the 90s and early 2000s, like Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Aladdin. But when they go too far back, like Snow White, it was a big misfire. And then when it's been too recent, I think that'll be just an interesting test case, because Moana is from it's remaking a movie that came out in 2016, and they just had the animated sequel come out in 2024, and so it hasn't been that long since audiences have seen the original version of this movie.
I have noticed that the sweet spot of nostalgia for the internet seems to be things from about 20 to 25 years ago. Well,
Lilo and Stitch was another example of one that was enormous, and that one is from 2002, so To your point, yes, that definitely is the sweet spot.
Rebecca, as always, thank you for toughing it out here on a very hot weekend to give us the mixed results at the box office. Always appreciate you doing the analysis for us.
Thank you.
And now we'll hear from KJ Yossman, one of Variety's great reporters out of the UK. She explains the significance of the deal orchestrated between Sky, now owned by Comcast, and ITV. ITV CEO Carolyn McCall has been building up to this transaction pretty much since she took the helm of the company in January 2018. KJ Yossman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Busy day, big business deal going down in the UK. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but it's also still one of those things you also didn't expect it first thing in the morning. No. KJ, tell us the baseline. What was announced this morning between ITV, one of Britain's biggest television companies, and Sky, also a big television company?
Today, Sky announced that they are acquiring ITV, a 70-year-old British public service broadcaster, for a total of $2.1 billion, which is made up of a variety of moving parts. So a chunk of that is $1.61 billion in cash at completion. But they are also having a kind of swap over. Sky owns Love Productions, which makes the Great British Bake Off. And they are going to be selling that for a total of about $268 million to ITV Studios, which is being spun off as a standalone company. So it's quite a complicated transaction. And then there's another very large payment of up to $268 million, which is tied to advertising revenue performance. So there's sort of three pieces to this transaction. But ultimately what it means is that Sky will end up with ITV, the public service broadcaster, and its proprietary streaming platform, ITVX, and ITV Studios is going to be a standalone production conglomerate, effectively, because I think it owns about 60 studios within it across the world, including in the US, in LA. And that will be listed on the London Stock Exchange. However, there is obviously a lot of chatter about the fact that it may very quickly find itself snapped up. But currently that's the position.
I remember ITV went on almost a 10-year binge of buying many, many companies. It was really just an extraordinary effort to just go out there and build that business, in which they did. But of course, in the world that we're talking about now, ITV Studios, separate from the network and the streaming platform, that is going to be a smaller concern, and it's going to, even by comparison to other British super indies, given the movement, like with Banijay buying all three, I mean, it just feels like musical chairs sometimes. Put it in U.S. terms, it's almost like HBO buying CBS, which is, in fact, that union is coming together in the United States with the Parabros merger that we have decided it's Parabros, that Paramount, Skydance, Warner Brothers Discovery merger, which is also in the process. But KJ, there have been rumors, ITV sale rumors, for also more than a decade. Why did it happen now?
In fact, we obviously spoke to Carolyn and did a profile on her 3 years ago. We put the question to her then, is ITV Studios for sale? She was very firm about the fact that ITV Studios was not for sale. And in fact, she was correct. They have not sold ITV Studios. I think no one could have predicted then that they would sell ITV. The market is in a very difficult place. And ultimately, the view at the moment is that scale is going to be the only way to compete, particularly for UK companies. And so, for example, the market share of Sky and ITV together is still not market share, but in terms of viewing figures, ITV and Sky together is still fewer viewing figures than YouTube. So YouTube is getting a huge amount of eyeballs and consequently advertising dollars. And increasingly, the feeling here is that it's impossible to compete unless you have almost effectively a US studio behind you, but certainly scale. And by bringing ITV and Sky together, and it is an interesting proposition because one is pay and one is free, and together they sort of complement each other potentially quite well. They will be able to to compete in terms of scale, but obviously that's got knock-on effects elsewhere in the market.
It's the YouTube of it all is so interesting because YouTube is becoming a competitive force out there, but it's still a little different than the traditional business of commissioning shows and putting up advertising. Netflix, when they were pushing for Warner Brothers Discovery, they were pointing to YouTube and say, hey, this is our competition, and they're massive and they have a level of scale. And there was a debate about, is this an apples to oranges or an apples to apples? It will be so interesting if the YouTube of it all becomes a factor in ITV, if regulators are like, no, this is too much market share. Let me ask you, ITV, the network, the channel service itself, how is it doing? Does it have hits? My sense is it's been a little bit thin on new hits in recent years.
No, I think that's probably fair. I think, Love Island has obviously taken the US by storm. But here it's sort of waned a little bit, and, it's not really had much since The X Factor and Britain's Got Talent. These are all quite old formats at this point. And then in terms of news, as well, it's just struggling to compete, even, with social media. So everywhere there is constant erosion of audience figures. And it does make it very difficult, I think, in terms of advertising.
And for the Comcast of it all, it's interesting to see them putting money down to buy a big linear asset. But your reporting is telling us that they're really going after the ITVX streaming platform.
Yes, that's our sense, is that is really where the value for them is that they've paid all this money effectively for a streaming platform. ITVX, Carolyn has done a fantastic job. When she came in, she was absolutely laser focused on streaming. They had a huge launch a couple of years ago. They've really invested in content. They completely flipped their strategy where they would debut, and in fact, most of the broadcasters here have followed suit. So they now debut new shows on the streaming platform ITVX, and they might then end up on the linear channel a few months later, sometimes half a year later, which when she first explained that just seemed completely crazy, but now increasingly makes sense as a strategy. So the streaming platform, I think, is a very important part of that.
What is your instinct? Will this be a really uphill climb in the regulatory review process?
No, I mean, everything I'm hearing, and that's what's really interesting, is obviously there is the comparison from about 15, 16 years ago when Sky under Murdoch tried to almost sort of secretly buy ITV. And it was, they really clamped down back then. And what I'm hearing from everybody is the landscape has completely changed. The threat now is from these American giants, social media giants, whether it's Meta or Google, YouTube, Netflix, and that it is a completely different landscape. And in fact, the signs are that the government in its current form will be in fact quite supportive of these kinds of mergers and acquisitions, because the main goal is obviously to keep at least the PSB as a going concern. And if it has to be sold to an American studio to do that, it's still better than the alternative, which is for it to go bust.
KJ, thank you for dropping everything to work on this story. Really appreciate it. I know this isn't the last that we'll talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
As we close out today's episode, here's a few things we're watching for. The Emmy Award nominations will be out on Wednesday. Please go check out my colleague Clayton Davis's final predictions, and please go to Variety.com early on Wednesday for all your Emmy needs. Aye, aye, Captain. July 14th is SpongeBob Day per Nickelodeon. SpongeBob voice actor Tom Kenny will host a TikTok live event that day, and a new official Patrick Star channel will launch on YouTube, among many other activations planned for the day. Before we go, congrats to Shauna Sullivan. She's been promoted to Senior VP of Corporate Communications for Fox Corp. She oversees 2B Media Group, Fox One, Red Seat Ventures, AdRise, and other divisions. Sullivan joined 2B in early 2023 as VP of Communications and Publicity. Thanks for listening. This episode was written and reported by me, Cynthia Littleton, with contributions from Rebecca Rubin and KJ Yossman. Stick, snicks, hick, picks. Please leave us a review at the podcast platform of your choice, and don't forget to tune in tomorrow for another episode of Daily Variety.